why don't we, this is the question, I guess I'll direct this to Taftoj, to Conspiracy Castle, and to Christian in particular. Why would you guys prefer to forfeit Ukraine and then have to deal with Russian aggression when the battle lines are closer to us? Why not nip it in the bud, just put in some troops there and send a message to Putin to say, look, we're not going to tolerate wars against democracies in Europe, because we know if we let this go, it'll be another one and another one, because they've demonstrated this with Georgia in 2008 and Crimea and the rest of Ukraine in 2014.
I'm going to have Christian respond, because Christian raised his hand and hasn't been able to talk in a while. So I'm going to have Christian respond to that question, since it was directed towards.
So yeah, I'll be very quick before I respond to that question. We have to deal with this argument that if you're somehow skeptical of using military force, not against Russia, but in proximity to Russia's geopolitical aggression, that you are somehow on Russia's side. I can give you two reasons that are not at all pro-Russia, but are instead pro-other things, pro-common sense rather, that would lead us skeptical to such incursions. Number one, the question of moral obligation towards other countries, which I mentioned earlier, which wasn't really answered. Number two, the erosion of American diplomatic capital through continued aggression. And number three, the continuation of American imperialism, which has caused destruction and chaos across the world. Those are three reasons why someone could be reasonably skeptical of going into this with a more aggressive stance that had nothing to do with being pro-Russia. And the assertion that if you are against this, or some kind of force towards Russia in this circumstance, you are pro-Russia, is absolutely an ad hominem of the lowest sort. So let's not use that argument anymore. Now, as for the battle lines and everything, look, I'm not saying let Russia seize Ukraine. I'm asking what, and I'm saying the European powers, some of whom have, again, different degrees of moral obligation and different degrees of interest in ensuring that Ukraine remains in sovereign hands, they have the ability to act. I'm particularly concerned about the United States' obligation, or lack of obligation, lack thereof of obligation, towards Ukraine. And really, I have no problem with the United States using diplomatic capital to, and even what Taft said. I mean, I've been listening very closely. I have no problem even supplying them with weapons. Now, the problem is America has supplied people with weapons in the past, and they've gotten into the wrong hands. So I typically tend to be very skeptical of that. But I have no problem even supplying them with weapons. And I do not think Biden should have pulled out our diplomatic personnel, and neither does Zelensky. And Zelensky was very mad at him for that. So there are steps we can take to ensure that Ukraine remains somewhat in America's sphere of geopolitical influence. But those steps should not at all elevate to the level of military aggression, even if it's just placing troops on Ukraine's border. The United States has no obligation to do so.
So Christian, who do you think is the imperial power in the Ukraine-Russia dynamic? Do you think it's Russia, or do you think it's America?
That's an obvious question. Obviously, Russia's the imperial power, but one's imperialism does not negate another's imperialism. America has been an imperialist nation for many decades, and that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be handled.
How does helping a sovereign country resist Russian imperialism? How is that imperialist? Okay.
That's a straw man. I just gave you a few examples of how we can actually help them without putting troops on the ground. Putting boots on the ground is another example of American imperialism. Having diplomatic personnel is not. Yes, absolutely.
Really?
Yes.
So defending a sovereign country that asks, their sovereign government asks for help. It's not like we're just invading them. Their sovereign country, their sovereign government begs for military support, and you say, we can't help you. That would be imperialism. Is that
No, I didn't say. You are pretending like I'm saying that you cannot help them at all. I'm saying there are more ways to help Ukraine. There are more ways to help Ukraine. There are more ways to help Ukraine.
You're characterizing sending troops there to deter an invasion. You're characterizing that as imperialism.
In the context of the American Global Project, absolutely, having thousands of troops situated across the world, across Europe, in countries that we are absolutely not even at war with. Yes, I absolutely think that's imperialism of a certain kind of sort. It is imperialism.
Sorry,
no, it's not.
Really
How's it dumb? How's it dumb?
Because
dumb?
Imperialism is going in and taking over other people's shit, other people's countries without their permission.
That's one function of it.
Putting words in my mouth like that. No, I think that people are just looking for a far more intersectional representation of ideas and beliefs that exist in America. And if you are patriotic and believe in the democracy that has been created by America, we should be pushing for more equal representation, because
I don't believe in democracy.
Oh.
Okay.
Wow.
America is not a democracy. I don't believe in democracy.
Okay.
I don't believe in democracy.
Yeah, libertarian doesn't believe in democracy. Who would?
I believe in. No, I don't.
Wait, are you a libertarian?
Yes.
With the bears?
What do you believe in
the
then?
libertarian with the bears? Was it New Hampshire? Was it the bear, Colin? Was it the bears?
What?
Wasn't there a libertarian colony in America somewhere, but it didn't last very long because the bears came in and ate all
okay. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of
libertarianism is not
there's a lot of libertarian pop-ups. So. Of course it is. Of course, there's libertarianism.
So why are you so passionate about the idea of the Supreme Court if you're a libertarian? Like, why is your opinion so strong on this?
Because I have to deal with practical circumstances. And a lot of folks think that libertarians are not deal with practical stuff. We do. I have to deal with practical circumstances. At least I do. As someone who is interested in philosophy and who actually wants to help the American experiment get better and better and better, I have to deal with practical circumstances. And in my opinion, trying to distort the image of the Supreme Court by injecting equity and diversity and inclusion into the Supreme Court is going to hurt the American experiment. So I have a moral obligation to stand up for not for the Supreme Court, for the American experiment in the form of that kind of resistance. Righteous
your version of America is rooted in not the 1950s, but probably at the 1850s at this level.
Oh, Jesus.
What moral opposition would you have had? Like, again, we saw this in the previous segment where you couldn't tell that that moral action was needed to be taken against Russia. What moral argument would you have against the abolition of slavery then? Because the logical conclusion of what you're arguing, and I've got a question for you as well.
Dude, you're comparing the Supreme Court justice to the abolition of slavery. That shows you how dumb that is the dumbest analogy I've ever heard in my life.
Wait, Alex.
Talk about cringe.
Alex,
you like to go cringe.
Alex,
that's cringe.
No. Please, wait, everybody, please let Kevin finish asking the black person why he'd be against slavery. Continue.
Yeah, no, I'm just, it's a simple question. It's a simple a question that I have basically, which is that you've said that you're against democracy. You've said that suffrage would be forcing people to have rights. And you've also said that you're opposed to injecting equity and whatnot into the Supreme Court. The world that you're laying out is a very reactionary vision of America that's not shared by most Americans and not in the direction that America is moving. And I think that the founding fathers of America ultimately envisioned a self-perfecting system that they knew that they were flawed from the outset. And it seems like you want to keep a lot of these flaws and maintain their sort of institutionalization. My question for you, Christian, is very simple, which is that you said in your intro, you said that that you felt that what does this do for everybody who's black or everybody who's a woman? Because you said that that not everybody who meets those characteristics is in the judiciary, but you acknowledged, it was almost implicit in your acknowledgement there, that this would be helpful or could be seen as helpful if you are black and a woman and you're in law. So I guess my question is, your logic seems to be, because we can only kind of solve one thing a little bit here that only affects a few people, and we can't do everything at the same time at once, therefore do nothing. My question to you is, do you actually genuinely want to help people that are historically disadvantaged, or is it almost concern trolling, I guess is what I'm asking.
Oh my Jesus. So what you're doing there is, first of all, you equivocated. So there is absolutely no similarity between the abolition of slavery, which was a righteous cause founded on the principle of natural law, and the idea of having a black woman in the Supreme Court or in the corporate boardroom. There is absolutely no relationship to me that seems to be very clear between those two. Putting people in bondage against their rights is a violation of their natural rights, and that's something that obviously every moral person should respond to. Putting a black woman in an institution to say that you are now representing people, when in all reality there is no one person of any group that represents anyone of that group, that is not the same thing, and that is an absurdity. And that is my point. I want to help people who have been quote unquote historically disadvantaged by allowing us to have a meritocratic colorblind system that does not take into account their identity or their race, but takes into account what they can do. The problem is, and this is what W.E.B. Du Bois said in The Soul of Black Folk, the problem has never been that black folks have been unqualified. W.E.B. Du Bois said that the black race will be saved by its best, he said the Negro race will be saved by its best men. The problem is their merits have not been historically, in a lot of places historically, not been acknowledged by the broader system, or they have been forcibly suppressed by the broader system. So what do? You change that, not by trying to do a sort of reverse type of thing where you look at their skin color and above their merits and then put them in positions, but you change that by looking blindly at their merits. And you do that by embracing a colorblind system that does not embrace diversity, equity, or inclusion. You are presuming that DEI, or having this sort of equitable mindset, is the only way way to correct historical injustice, and that is absolutely not correct. So I think that your argument is just absolutely. Well, then your argument acts. One second. Your argument acts if this is the only way, because you have been saying, well, you don't want to do this or that, so you must not want to help people. No, I don't want to buy into the system. I don't want to buy into the false paradigm that says these are the ways we have to address these issues. There are ways that are not particularly orthodox that we can use to address these issues that embrace a spirit of radical individualism that are founded upon the American system. But the medical authorities have run a lot of Americans through the ringer, right? So we had the Fauci situation about the masks. Then we had the guidance about who needs to have the COVID shot, which then changed almost overnight. And of course, this wouldn't be a problem because, look, it's a novel virus. This is a novel virus. This wouldn't be a problem if the policies that were built upon that advice also didn't change and weren't so overbearing. So I would just say, when the government does something, it tends to have a certain kind of permanence to it. And that permanence can be a good or bad thing. I think throughout COVID, we've seen immense economic turmoil from the shutdown of economies. We've seen people getting arrested simply for not having a mask on. We've seen a lot of different things happen, which has caused. We've seen, the sort of disregarding of the lives of cancer patients or nursing home residents to fulfill a political agenda. And in the case of Andrew Cuomo, who was kind of rebuked by a few judges in his state for not designating certain areas with the correct level of COVID severity. Right. I mean, we've seen so many missteps from the government that if people are not mistrusting at this point, you just have to really level with them and ask them, okay, obviously something deeper is going on. You've been taught something deeper, or you've absorbed something deeper. The terms in which you regard the government are very profound in your psyche. Why do you believe this? And that's the question that we ask of repensive politics. Why do you believe what you believe? Challenge your foundations, critically analyze them, then go about seeing if they're truth. As Emerson said, you have to test goodness to see if it be goodness. That's how any political philosophy can be advanced. But I think that it's how the true one, minarchism, can also be advanced. Rather than a static thing. Some people justify their entire lives by saying, I was raised to do X. Well, were you always meant to stay in X, though? Because what you were raised to do may not be what you are meant to do in this point in time. Similar to the media. Now, the problem is when you have these institutions that are bound foundationally to a particular political ideology, whether it be MSNBC, CNN, or whatever, they cannot move beyond the trap of experience, i.e. the subjective, because their entire legitimacy, their ability to be on the air, their ability to exist, is based squarely in the subjective. Therein lies the problem. We are living amongst people who give us information, amongst politicians like Trudeau, who give us information, who are trapped by their own experience, and if they were to even forsake their own experiences, even if they wanted to, it would threaten their way of life. It would threaten their hold on authority. It would threaten their ability to do what they do. Hence, the principle of self-interest. Oh, my friends, there's a way to fight this. Ultimately, we are all a minority of one. Not all of us. All of us do not have the ability to change the world, and nor should we try to change the world. But what we can do, we can change how we interact with the world. And my friends, if enough of us were to simply withdraw from the dictates of the politicians and withdraw from the allure of the established media, and we were to do our own research, look within, and look out in the world, as opposed to applying our values immediately to everything, then perhaps we would have a much better grasp on reality, a much better grasp on what is true and what is false, and a much better mind for which to deal with the challenges that we're necessarily going to face as people who think, or as human beings in general. That is the solution. But let me ask you a question. Are you willing to rise up, question your beliefs, look outside of yourself, evaluate everything, even things that you hold dear so to your heart, so you can usurp any falsehood that tries to take you? Or will you fall to the same trap that Scarborough, Trevor Noah, CNN, all of them have fallen in, and are trying to take the political discourse in the West down by not evaluating anything critically and simply applying your values to everything before even knowing what you're applying them to. The latter is a recipe for disaster. The former may very well be the elixir that saves the American experiment and allows the West to persist as it has been for so many years. Think on it, my friends. And speaking of musicians, by the way, who are political, at least their being involved in politics, at least speaking out, shows that they do grapple with some of these things, even if they do so in a way that I don't agree with. For example, one of my favorite musicians, Springsteen. Well, Springsteen and I probably don't agree very much on politics whatsoever. But I mean, the dude's voice, contrary to popular opinion, is awesome in my opinion. I love the gravelly, blue collar voice. I think it's awesome. I
love Springsteen.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. But, you know, he grapples with issues in a way differently than I do, but at least he grapples with them. At least he's not sitting down and just saying, well, it has nothing to do with me. That's a good thing. I want to see more people voicing their opinions, as long as those opinions are informed and based in some kind of reality. And I think that musicians who do politics do that in some instances, and sometimes they do so to a bad effect, like Neil Young. I think Neil Young's, what he did with Spotify was, I mean, he's grappling with something, but it's not a good thing per se, right? He was effectively trying to censor Joe Rogan on the basis of a false perception of Joe Rogan, right? Because Joe Rogan has had a lot of people on his show, mainstream experts like Sanjay Gupta, and experts that kind of buck the narrative like Dr. Malone and McCulloch. And Rogan just casts his entire show as a platform for a complete falsehood, which is just not true. So, you know, we want people to grapple with reality, but we want them to do so in a manner that respects it as well. And I think a lot of these musicians butcher reality in their attempt to grapple with it. I mean, yeah, I'm not trying to go on too long here, but you look at you go to Barbra Streisand's her Twitter page. It's entirely disparaging people who may have right-leaning views. You go Michael McDonald, one of my favorite musicians, who came out of the 80s, great, beautiful voice, Blue-Eyed Soul, the Doobie Brothers, awesome stuff. You go to his Facebook page, it's all disparaging right-leaning people. So whereas music has this sort of unifying effect, when the musicians themselves go against that, I think they're kind of sullying the impact their product could have. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And as a musician, how do you suggest people, because there's a conversation about separating the art from the artist, right? I'm not sure how you feel about that.
Yeah.
But how do you, sorry. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, you know, what, you know, wasn't it Michael Jordan who was like, they were asking him, you know, why are, you know, it was something about Republicans or whatever. And he was like, Republicans buy sneakers too.
Yeah.
A little bit confused here. How is buying a mansion in a predominantly white neighborhood in Canada helping alleviate racial justice in the United States of America?
Well, it's not. And Black Lives Matter's lack of transparency should be concerning to anyone who genuinely does care about Black lives. But this, Rachel, underscores a broader problem within Black Lives Matter. And that problem is that Black Lives Matter's ideology actually does not help a single inner city kid at all. It teaches them that they are victims to things they cannot control, and then goes ahead to say to fix that they have to be radical activists for the political left. This is against the sober advice of men like Booker T. Washington, who encourage Black folks to perfect themselves and their communities and those they love, as opposed to trying to change the world. So perhaps Black Lives Matter should fix its own backyard and get its own stuff in order before trying to supposedly save Black folks. I am a 22-year-old recent college graduate, and I have student debt that transcends the amount that President Biden wants to forgive. But I don't want his handout. When I went to college, I studied philosophy. And throughout my life, I have been studying philosophy with keen interest in political philosophy, with even more interest in how our founders in the United States formed this great republic. And I always wanted to know, using those principles, how can we live better lives? How can we decide if certain things ought to be avoided and if certain things ought not to be avoided? And when I think about the big forgiveness package just given by the Biden administration,
I think about a complete and utter violation of principles that this nation was built upon. My friends, duty is a very important aspect to society. Without duty, society doesn't actually exist. Society is built upon a sense of duty amongst all of its members to respect the property, the integrity, the character of each other, and then to order their actions in accordance with that respect. And yet Joe Biden today just advocated the biggest abandonment of duty that we have seen, that this nation has seen since the beginning of the 21st century. Oh yes, there have been big abandonments of duty advocated by different kinds of presidents, but this is the most flagrant. And a president does not believe that our mutual duty to each other as citizens is important, is a president who does not legitimately occupy the Oval Office in a morally legitimate way. I intend to respect my obligations as a loan holder. I intend to respect my fellow man. I intend to adhere to the proper foundations of moral conduct. I also intend to, in the spirit of our Declaration, in the spirit of America's constitutional ethos, recognize my duty where it is and take it where it belongs, not throw it to the wayside because it's convenient for me.
And everybody is subject to everybody else. But you see, when you get into this attitude of, I am entitled to be safe, I don't like the idea that there's any danger, I should be in this absolute force field of safety. Well, guess what? You live on the planet Earth. You can get wiped out by hurricane, tsunami, tornado, typhoon, lightning can strike you. You can get frozen. If there is a cold snap, you can die of heat stroke. If you got a heat wave, you can deal with the effects of drought, starvation. You can get eaten up by a shark. You can be out having a flat tire, driving across country, and a grizzly, if you're up there in Wyoming, can snatch you and have a snack. All kinds of things can happen. You can be surfing in a great white smiley, we call him, those of us who scuba dive, he can have a nice snack and you're gone. You can get hit by a meteorite, asteroid, Betelgeuse, the supermassive red star 500 light years away, which is about to go nova, can go nova, and everybody gets wiped out. And you get no advance warning. All kinds of stuff can happen. See, so it's not safe being alive on the planet Earth. Hell, first time I got elected to judge, it was July. The election was going to be 2 weeks later. And I was at this picnic campaigning, and I'd gone around shaking everybody's hand. It was broad daylight, not a cloud in the damn sky. And I said, okay, man, I'm tired. And I leaned up against a tree, and I'd put my hands back, pushed off, took one step, and the damn thing, he got hit by lightning. Bam, flames, splinters everywhere. I didn't get touched by anything, but I could have gotten fried right there. So, I mean, it's not safe.
Reality is dangerous. Life is dangerous. It throws all kinds of things in our way. And this mentality that you can avoid it is a result of fantasy. And that result of fantasy is a result of comfort. And that result of comfort is a result of society. We have a very comfortable society right now. And I think that that's, Judge, I don't mention this often, but I'm 22. So I'm young. And I grew up in an age right now where we're the most comfortable that we've been in a very long time. The processing power we have in our phones, that we have in our computers, the ability to communicate with people, the ability to be social without actually physically seeing someone. And when you grow up, I'm sure there were challenges that required you to interface with them more in a more intimate way than
we didn't have these.
Right.
At all.
Right.
And
that's weakness.
You could find a handy phone booth, drop a dime in there. That's where drop a dime on some, that's where that came from. And
Yeah.
You know, we didn't have this thing when I was growing up. It didn't make any difference what your race was, white, black, brown, red, yellow.
Yeah.
In the summertime, the kids, we'd leave in the morning. We're in elementary school. We knew, everybody knew to be back when the street lights came on, which is about 8:30. So between 8 and 9 in the morning, where are you going? I'm going with Alan and James and Lodrick. You know, we're going to hang out. Richard, you know, I think we're going to the park. Or you might decide to go swimming. And when nobody was hovering around the pool to see if you drowned, you know, you went.
Now, the term leftists are using to describe rights is the term positive rights. And this is an idea that someone does not have the right to refrain from violating what you already have. Positive rights signifies two things. Number one, you don't already have something, that you need something that you have to get for somebody else to be able to live a good life. And number two, someone has an obligation to provide you with that something else. So whereas a negative rights viewpoint would say, well, I have a right to my life, so you cannot murder me, a positive rights viewpoint would say, I have a right to my life, so give me health care. But healthcare is a service that springs from someone else's faculty of reason and thus is in the domain of their own liberty, which you, under the negative rights paradigm, must respect. But according to leftist ideology, you don't have to respect that idea because that person has an obligation by virtue of some abstract idea to give you what is already in their possession. This is an inversion of justice. This is a warped understanding of rights, and this is precisely what abortion protesters and opportunists and politicians like Michelle Obama, like Barack Obama are using in their analysis of the Dobbs decision. And as I mentioned, it is a fundamental, flagrant confusion of terms. Rights, as the etymological base, ius, has shown to us, are things that belong to you, not things that are given to you. And the Constitution, sure as hell, doesn't have the power to change human physiology and change the nature of rights. The Constitution merely recognizes what we already have in our possession, as Grotius would say, as he describes justice. Also, there's a further reason why the idea of positive rights makes no sense. If rights, again, are a matter of ius, and they're a matter of things that already belong to you, if that is literally the origin of the word, then you saying that rights are not a matter of that is an attempt to redefine the basis of the word itself. This is not like when words have double meanings, like when you can say, I'm going to kill the lights or I'm going to kill a person. Well, in both cases, you're still doing something that eliminates something. In one case, you're eliminating light. In the other case, you're eliminating a life. It's still, both of those meanings still adhere to the foundational premise of the word kill. But positive rights doesn't even adhere to the foundational premise of the word rights. It completely and utterly guts it and redefines it. Thus, positive rights is not only invalid because it is definitionally unsound, it is invalid because it is an attempt to redefine a word and present itself as that word, when in all reality, it is simply an illusion masquerading under that word. It should be rejected as forcefully as these nonsensical, emotionally laden, progressive outcries over Dobbs should be. I believe the foundation will confirm the structure in due time. Well, the conceptual tool I want to give all of you to help fight anti-American hate is the conceptual tool that understands the ethos of America, understands the basis of this country. America is the only country founded on the axiom, that means the rule, the principle of individual moral agency. America is the only country that looked at the individual and evaluated the individual's relationship with nature, with reality, with the world, and drew moral conclusions from that relationship that are not dependent on the power of a king, that are not dependent on the power of a government, but are instead written on the heart, are instead ingrained into what it means to be human. In a sense, America is the first country to recognize and be completely pro-human because it understood Our founders understood the conditions under which life flourishes and under which life must necessarily be situated by going to theorists like John Locke and Grotius and Pufendorf and taking their sentiments and then implementing them into the country, building a structure of a republic meant to reinforce those principles, not to rebel against them, which is interesting because Max Boot, the infamous writer of the Washington Post, said that our founders never conceptualized an America in which, essentially is what he said, in which there was a disproportionate relationship between population and power, when in all reality, the founders conceptualized an America like that, and they did everything in their power to engineer the structure of our country not to go down that path, to go against the passions of faction, as Madison said in the Federalist Papers. So you have to understand what America's fundamental ethos is. This is the conceptual tool. America is at the base, situated on an axiom that affirms the moral agency of the individual, that affirms the individual as the facilitator of moral action by situating him in reality. Reality being limited and ordered in such a way as if reality is ordered in a way that necessitates certain things. So for example, we have laws of gravity. We have all kind of different laws of reality, but we also have the broader idea around these laws called the natural law, the natural order. And if political institutions are concerned with the nature of reality, then they have to ultimately be limited to the terms of reality, and the founders understood this, and they derived those terms from natural law. They understood, okay, if man cannot preserve his life, then society doesn't exist, then government doesn't exist at all. So man, being necessary to be living, to preserve his life, must have that right afforded to him, or that right must be preserved. If man cannot keep property, then okay, he cannot operate in the world, and his life becomes very difficult. Again, the founders understood these basic principles and applied them. And that ultimately is what it means, what this country means in its fundamental sense. Okay, here's the rhetorical tool. Now, I mentioned the confusion between the universal and the local a few moments ago. My friends, if you want to understand the American experiment, you have to understand foundations, obviously. Now, it's like if you want to understand a river, you cannot understand a river without understanding the principle of movement. Because without movement, the river dies, ecosystems die, and it's no longer a river. And thus, without the spirit of individual liberty and natural law upon which our nation is based upon, America is not America. But when people say, oh my gosh, slavery was a part of American experiment. Discrimination, the excavation of the Native Americans from their lands are part of the American experiment, and now women's rights are under attack or whatever. You have to understand one thing. America, if you think of it like a building, is currently, what people currently see when they see America, they see a superstructure. They see the structure of the building, but they don't actually see the foundational base upon which that structure is built upon. And man, being imperfect, cannot, in all cases, reflect universal moral ideas. And our government, throughout its history, has constantly rebelled and violated its own foundations, which is why the American government has been not working efficiently for a very long time. It's not because Congress just spends a lot. They spend a lot in negation to what they're supposed to be doing as a government. They've extended themselves beyond their proper role as a government, and that extension is a byproduct of more spending, but that extension also is a violation of the moral ethos of the country. Transhumanists want to transcend both political boundaries and the sort of personal boundaries that our current sort of, I'll say, meat condition imposes upon us, right? And they want to do so by reworking the human condition with technology. Would that be a correct claim to make?
Yes, that's okay. Quite correct.
And so the distinction between the public and the private for the transhumanist is pretty much an illusory derivative of our current nature, which doesn't have to be so, right? Because like if you were to transcend our current condition, then ethics would have to follow, Medicine would have to follow. Every other topic within society that allows society to work would have to necessarily follow, because all those right now are situated around the current human condition. And so this debate between the public and the private, the social man versus the individual man, the sovereign individual versus the collective, would be completely reworked by this sort of new transhumanist condition. How do you imagine it would be reworked? Like, what would that entail in your opinion?
Well, I do agree it's going to be reworked. And that's why I think when people say, oh, the Constitution must last forever, they're really talking about a biological human being, a biological American, let's just say, if we're dealing with only America. But that's just not going to be the future. I mean, the future is going to be cyborgism. People are going to have synthetic parts all over. Their iPhones are going to be in their brains, or at least attached to their brains 24/7. And I feel like just a bunch of new experiences and new not regulations, but new ideas and laws regarding how we live are going to be applied. And I think, you can already start seeing it even in terms of, let's say, crypto, starting to try to challenge the traditional way that we deal with money. But it's not just, that, it's every single field, genetic editing in the field of medicine, the idea that, now we can literally rewire ourselves so we don't get cancer. Maybe that's the way to beat cancer, is not through trying to give us, therapy, but actually to make it so human beings never get cancer in the first place. These are novel and revolutionary ways of looking at the human being. They're just examples of something that's happening in every single field. Like the classic one that because I'm just currently a graduate student at the University of Oxford, and I did a week on environmental studies, and there's so many people trying to stop global warming, trying to stop climate change, and I believe in climate change and those things too, but the transhumanist doesn't actually want to change the earth. It wants to change itself so that it's not affected by global warming. It doesn't need food to survive. It doesn't, it's just a very different way of looking, and maybe some people will say selfish way, but we want to change ourselves so that we're able to overcome any odds that are thrown our way, even things that might be so dramatic as, climate change in a very severe level. And that's really how transhumanists are approaching everything in their lives.
All right, everybody. So to close out this show, we have the exclusive that you all have been waiting for, the statement from the office of Governor Ron DeSantis, who gave this exclusively to Pensive Politics. I am so grateful to his press secretary, Christina Pushaw. I'm grateful to Governor DeSantis. I'm grateful to all of them. DeSantis, I don't care what you think about him. I think he is objectively one of the best governors that America has right now in terms of defending liberties and rights and understanding the proper rule of government. And I really believe that if it was a DeSantis national security strategy, this entire deal would look different. I genuinely believe that, just based on his actions. So here is the statement released on the guidance. I just read parts of the guidance to you. This is the statement released on the guidance from the office of Governor Ron DeSantis. The statement says this. It begins. Rights are God-given, and in our Constitution, the states are the primary vehicles to protect people's rights and freedoms. In Florida, Governor DeSantis has led the way in defending our rights, from federal overreach. For example, he successfully fought back against unconstitutional vaccine mandates imposed by federal bureaucrats. He has enacted unprecedented protections for parents' rights to direct the upbringing of their own children without government interference or indoctrination. And the state of Florida has sued the Biden administration to stop the destructive, unlawful catch and release policy that allows countless illegal aliens to pour into our state. It is ironic the Biden administration's interim guidance on national security does not offer proposals that would address the number one national security threat to our country, the Biden border crisis. The humanitarian crisis at the uncontrolled border is devastating our country while enriching transnational organized crime groups, including narcotics traffickers, drug cartels, sex traffickers, and human smugglers. Deadly drugs like fentanyl have flooded across the open border into our communities, and tragically, the number one cause of death today among ages 18 to 45 is fentanyl overdose. That's correct. Fentanyl and other illicit drugs trafficked across the border are killing Floridians every day. Illegal aliens with criminal backgrounds or stolen identities have also entered our communities and murdered Floridians. The open border is an existential crisis for our country, and the Biden administration seems content to pretend it is not happening. The term social justice is a red flag because it denotes Marxist ideology of collective guilt. Just as every individual has God-given rights, justice should also be a concept that applies to individuals, not collective blocks or identity groups. She is absolutely correct. I'll get more into this in a second. When an individual commits a crime, justice may be served if the individual is caught and prosecuted. But groups of people should not be punished collectively for the crimes of some of their members, or vice versa, as the concept of social justice suggests. Therefore, the Biden administration's emphasis on this phrase and the national security interim guidance is troubling, to say the least. Governor DeSantis will continue to do everything in his power to defend Floridians' constitutional rights from any potential threats, including the threat of federal government overreach. So we have a national security strategy encroaching upon society, potentially threatening federalism by encroaching upon society in such an egregious manner, by trying to blend domestic policy and foreign policy together, even though both of them have radically different implications, and one clearly requires more government intervention than the second, foreign policy. So the implication is very clear. This is a governor that is saying, if this comes to my state, I'm going to fight. Name me one. That's the spirit of Paul Revere, of John Jay, of Thomas Jefferson. Name me one other governor in this nation that has even considered thinking about this, much less releasing a statement saying, if this comes to my state, I'm fighting. I'm going to protect the people of my state from government overreach. That is a beautiful sentiment. And I think Governor DeSantis, I think Ms. Pushaw, I hope I'm saying your name right. I think all of them. Thank you so much. Because Americans need to hear this. Americans need to hear that there is a warrior there willing to fight for their indivisible natural rights, the rights this country was founded upon. And when I can, the more I can tie certain principles that are in society back to foundations, back to ideas that we can observe throughout history, the more this social reality stuff becomes nonsense. And if I can tie the relationship between man, property, and society back to nature, I'm going to tie the relationship between woman and society back to nature as well. Once again, it is improper to call a woman a category when a category is simply a catch-all term for a bunch of related things. But woman is fundamentally one thing. There's nothing else in nature like the female type, whether it be in the animal kingdom, whether it be in humanity. Both of the women in every context, the animal kingdom and humanity, have many of the same traits. A lioness is typically quite feminine and caring with the cubs, whereas a lion is much more harsh and rough. A lion can be caring, absolutely, but a lion is typically the predator, whereas lionesses most certainly, they can be predators as well, but they're more maternal and caring. We've seen this all throughout nature, and we've seen this reflected in society as well. Now, there's a difference between saying that these things exist in nature, therefore they must be. There are certainly women that are not feminine or caring or whatever. There are certain women that are not at all how people think they should be, or how they are supposed to be or whatever. But there are certain traits that tie back to an area, to a space where society is not there. And if we can look at this area where society, social influence has not tainted it, then can't we draw something from that? If I can look at nature and say, okay, female creatures tend to act this way, and male creatures tend to act this way, and I can see that behavior resembled in humans, who are also animals, by the way, then wouldn't that suggest a universal truth, an objective reality about what these things are? And the functions of men and women are also different as well. Men can't get pregnant. Just they can't. Some folks think they can because they have this idea that man and woman are socially constructed. But if this is the case, then how come you cannot show me a full-blown biological male actually giving birth to anything when, but you can show me a trans male, which is a different category. Trans men, who, by the way, I have no problem with trans men per se, or trans anyone. I don't have a problem with them. I have a problem with gender ideologues. I have a problem with people like Butler who want to push this stuff onto people. But a trans man who is biologically a woman still has the function to produce a baby, but that's not the same thing because that's a different category. So once again, if I can look at functions and I can identify what sex or what gender has certain kinds of functions, I can therefore establish an idea of what they are. But Butler is saying that we're not actually looking at biological reality, or we can't look at biological sex because the language around biological sex is tainted by social realities created by oppressors. And this is the problem. The fundamental flaw of Judith Butler's ideology is that she is responding to ideas that she presumes possesses everybody, that she presumes controls everybody, including the ability for people to actually look into them and question them and reckon them. And that just ain't true. Yet, my friends, and yet, people still talk about democracy as if it is some pure word, as if it is some aspirational quality, when in all reality, democracy simply means simply a mechanism that is going to take the form of the context it's used in. A tool is only as good as he or she who wields it. So if I have a hammer and I use it to construct 10,000 houses, I'm doing a very good service with the hammer. But if I have a hammer and I use it to destroy people's windshields, I'm not doing a good service. The problem with defenders of democracy is that they presume that just because you have democracy, you guys aren't hearing me right now, just because you have democracy, you must have something virtuous. And that is not true. As the founders of this country understood, a government requires a virtuous people for moral things to happen. A government requires a virtuous people to function, and yet democracy simply assumes by the fact that more people are involved, this sort of utilitarian hell, more folks are involved, it must be virtuous. That is a backward assumption which clearly led to so much chaos in Athenian society. In fact, the government of Athens had to reform several times. It had been overthrown. It devolved into chaos because there was no core. The core was whatever those who were within it wanted. The core was whatever those who had the most numerically strongest number wanted. That was the core. But that core shifts because no one group of people are always going to have the most amount of number for any long period of time. But there's also another problem with democracy, my friends. It is this problem of tastes. As I mentioned, the tool is only as good as those who use it. The problem of taste says this: if the majority can decide what is good, what is bad, or whatever, what happens when the tastes shift? What happens when a different faction in the majority actually get in power and have the majority in a democratic society, and then they begin to use their democratic power to inflict it upon the rest of that society? This is precisely what happened, or kind of what happened, in Athens with Socrates. Socrates, my friends, the Greek philosopher, was killed by his own people in Athens for impiety. But there are also historians who speculate that Socrates was actually killed because of his association with people who were anti-democratic. And Socrates himself was actually quite anti-democratic in his own right. He did not believe that justice could be preserved in a democratic system where the majority basically decided where everything went. That, my friend, the problem of tastes, is what makes democracy breaks down. Because if you don't have, again, a stable core to your political assumptions, if it is all just based on arbitrary opinion, then you don't have any kind of policy that is consistent. You have a fashion, you have a temporary status that will shift inevitably when the next majority comes in. But also, we have to also ask ourselves this: does democracy even interact with the idea of freedom in a way that conforms to its proper understanding? Well, if you define freedom as the American founders defined freedom, and as I define freedom, as natural law defines freedom, and as is observable in nature, freedom is simply the capacity to act, which instills upon some other people a duty to not act in a certain way that could limit my capacity, and that is what we call rights. Rights are simply these qualities that human beings possess that impose upon other people to refrain from doing certain things to me. But democracy presumes that your rights are not merely things that are preserved, they are given by society, by the state, by the people, and they are voted upon and can be revoked anytime the majority wants to. So democracy not only has no stable core, democracy not only is just this wild beast of assent, democracy also rejects the very working principles of freedom, redefines it as something that is given to you, redefines freedom as a social and political system, not a natural fact to be preserved and confirmed through observation. So not only is democracy ignorant of what freedom is, democracy has a quasi idea of what freedom is, which is actually a false idea of what freedom is. And when freedom is not around in a political system, what do you get? You get authoritarianism.
"20 or 50 or even 100 years ago, if you asked someone which of the world's countries was the most diverse, most equitable, and most inclusive, they would have almost certainly answered the United States. Not anymore. What changed? Well, nothing and everything. Nothing in the sense that America is still the opportunity-rich place it's always been. And everything because the progressive left has hijacked those three words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and turned them into weapons of mass destruction. This DEI trio makes up the neutron bomb that has laid waste to a good part of our educational and corporate institutions. Given the damage that has been done, it might be a good idea to see what these words used to mean and what they mean now. Diversity used to mean that people of different backgrounds were free to join a group or association. Equity used to mean enforcing equal standards for all individuals and groups. Inclusion used to mean allowing people of every background and identity to participate in a group or association. Now, in their DEI context, these words all mean one thing: applying unequal standards to ensure preferential outcomes for individuals and groups based on race, sex, and gender identity. The DEI movement is not about a sincere desire to make educational or corporate institutions more diverse, more equitable, or more inclusive. If you don't believe me, try having an open discussion on your company message board or at your next DEI seminar about why the same standards should apply to everyone, everywhere, regardless of race, sex, or gender identity. Try that and you know what will happen. You'll be shouted down, shunned, reprimanded, and maybe fired. DEI is ultimately about only one thing: advancing those who are not white, heterosexual, and male at the expense of white, heterosexual men, regardless of their respective qualifications. If you say, well, that's fine, because white, heterosexual men had too many advantages for too long, then I would ask, what about all the women, gays, blacks, and Latinos who were born to privilege? Should they be recipients of DEI special preferences? And when do we know we've reached a DEI endpoint? When do we know that everything is finally diverse, equitable, and inclusive? There are no good answers to any of these questions. That's a feature, not a bug, of the DEI racket. America will never be able to DEI its way out of its DEI problem. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You never reach your goal because it doesn't exist. You'll never quite be diverse enough, equitable enough, or inclusive enough. The DEI obsession has been great for one group of people and one group only: the lavishly paid DEI administrators at every Fortune 100 company, college, and university, and all those who work under them. Corporations now pay millions upon millions of dollars to so-called DEI experts to spread division and distrust among their own employees. It may be the single most non-productive,
self-destructive thing a business can do to itself. But businesses, to their everlasting shame, are doing it anyway. They think they're trapped. If they don't set up a DEI office, that proves their company is racist, sexist, and homophobic. But if they do set up a DEI office, that proves their company is racist, sexist, and homophobic. Or why else did they set up a DEI office in the first place? Heads, DEI wins. Tails, you lose. All this is bad enough, but the DEI fraud is also condescending. It both manufactures and perpetuates victimhood. DEI assumes Black people can't hack it on their own. Neither can women or anyone who falls under the LGBTQI+ umbrella. They all need what only DEI can give them because no one can compete with the white, heterosexual Superman. The truth is that Americans of all races get along fine. Intermarriage rates, to cite just one example, are higher than they have ever been. The vast majority of Americans don't even think about race. They want to work hard and get ahead, and they know that America is the best place to do that. The big lie is the DEI made-up version of American life. And thanks to woke colleges and corporations, they're shoving it down our throats. So, how do we stop them? The solution is remarkably simple. Tell the truth. When they say you're racist, tell them the truth. You're not. When they call you a whatever-phobe, tell them the truth. You're not. The truth is the only thing that will set you, me, and the entire country free from this DEI monster. I'm Christian Watson of Colorist United and host of Pensive Politics for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.